So I think in today's session, what we find is the sense in which revolution for Lacan is also just formalized through the Hegelian master-slave dialectic, right? Which, of course, is repeatedly emphasized that this has a direct bearing on Pascal's wager, insofar as what is at stake with the master-slave dialectic is the one that is produced through the battle for prestige. So the battle for prestige, which is this famous Kojevian idea, is the kernel of what Lacan finds most novel about that the chapter on lordship and bondage from Hegel's phenomenology, right? So he repeats that over and over. But this time he's now connecting the battle for prestige to the question of the positing of the one of the self, or the positing of the imaginary whole, or the positing of this well, subject supposed to know, you could also say, but then he then, in a very clear sense, as we will read in a moment, argues that the subject supposed to know is not a subject. That's the key, I think, point of clarification that he offers in these first opening pages, which I think is a very useful way to understand this notion of the barred other, right? So man is defined as in struggle, which in capitalism we can then transplant that struggle to name it exploitation as a general fact of social life, for which the master-slave dialectic still plays itself out. But Lacan will try to historically sort of, and that's, I think, what's really nice about this session, more so than any prior sessions, he's beginning to historically differentiate how modernity still is imbued with this master-slave dialectic. So this is quite interesting. Go ahead, Matilda.
Yeah, like last time he left off with this idea that like he agrees workers are exploited, but that the masters don't enjoy the the the, the surplus from that, and that it seems like instead of gesturing towards like that situation, the economic situation, he wants to like kind of redirect us towards like our relation to knowledge and some like exploitative relationship we have with knowledge. And he does that by like kind of positioning this neurotic who wants to have enjoyment in knowledge and thinks that the analyst has that experience, and that somehow this analytic situation, like in the between the analyst and the analyst, is the path by which we can dispose of that illusion and somehow make a step forward. And for me, it seemed like there was some relationship with the means by that would happen is like the identification. He has this quote where it's like, is identification an aim or an obstacle? And how somehow the analyst becomes little a, and like S2 is like A is in the position of S2, and like the free associations are all these S1s going towards the other, who kind of becomes the analyst somehow in this new moment. And I'm trying to understand, it seems like what he's going to continue elaborating on is this process of identification, and the relationship of the analyst as little a. But I don't,
Yeah,
yeah, I'm kind of like sitting
yeah,
there.
yeah, yeah. The distinction hinges on between unary trait versus unary trace. This whole distinction of like the one to the other, which he will elaborate in a moment, is this same dialectic that we see in Pascal as well as in Hegel, which then can be transposed onto the analyst and dyad. So it functions in both domains and both registers in some sense. But there's also a very interesting claim at work here regarding human desire. Yeah. And the two-ness. He has this motif of the double over and over here that I think is quite apparent both in Pascal as well as in Hegel. So please, Akshay, jump in.
Sorry, what was I? I mean, it was just, I mean, I think when Luis was talking earlier, I mean, about this idea of it being counter-revolutionary, I mean, in the sense that, I wonder what the relationship between like Lacan's sort of structural account and like historicism more broadly is. But I think he does have some kind of notion of a revolution as like an actual transformation. Like I think at least when he's talking about scientific revolutions, like he constantly makes this reference to like it is an actual transformation of the world. So in that sense, I think there is like I don't think it's like totally all revolution is a kind of returning to the same place. Yeah, that's yeah. Sorry, it's not a very well fleshed out out.
Yes, Luis.
Yes. So, I mean, what Lacan is saying, I mean, because I was reading the Seminar 17, is that in the discourses, there are 4 discourses, right? And each one is a turn and a 25 degree, like one to a left, right? So you have 1/4, right? Yeah, 25 degrees, yeah. So you have, if you go through all of them, from the master to the historic, then the analyst, and then the university, then you go back to the master, right? So if you go in that sense, he means like a revolution goes 180 degrees, goes back to the master, right? Because for him, when he talks about scientific revolution, and this is what he is talking in this seminar, is that this doesn't start with the master alone, right? Is the hysteric the one that makes the revolution, right? So if there is something that is revolutionary, is in knowledge, right? Is with the hysteric, right? But then the whole thing, the whole turn, it goes beyond the hysteric, right? It goes to analysis, and then it's established again as a university discourse, right? And then if we will go back to the master, right? So I think this is 2 things, right? That is relevant.
I think you could read it that way, but like I mean, like even in sort of Marx, like in chapter 1 of Capital, right? Like when you have the commodity form and it's presented as like, this is how the universal equivalent must have formed. It's not like a historicist account. It's like logically these things should have happened. But then it's a question of like, you know, is it the logical structural account or the sort of genetic developmental account that sort of has causal priority? And I mean, I think you could interpret like even the stuff about knowledge in a similar way, like, you know, how people read Weber's Protestant ethic. Some people would go like, oh, that's an alternative to the kind of like Marxist developmental theory. Or you could just say that, no, this is actually sort of like subsumed within the Marxist theory in the sense that you can go like the you know, capitalist ethic of Protestantism is sort of like a necessary and sufficient condition that's like part of the superstructure that's not so I mean, I don't know, like in the sense that something about the historicism of the seminar to me sort of makes it think that he's not like it's not just cycling through 4 discourses. We are moving towards some kind of absolutization, right? Like of something. Like so I in that sense I'm not sure it's just like
maybe maybe I mean in Marxism there's a cycle, because in Hegel there is a cycle too. I mean for Marx is the communism will look like, you know, pre-industrial, pre-agricultural, you know, societies, right? So even that there is, but I think what Lacan maybe is trying to say is that to go through these 180 degrees you have to go through all these little stages, right? Maybe this is a point, because for Hegel and for Marx, right, the end will look like the beginning, but it will not be the same, right? There is something gained in the process of going back to the beginning, right? So there is this innate, inherent difference, right? That
Yeah.
will separate communism from pre-agricultural societies.
In Seminar 17, Lacan will give a very precise definition of what Marxism is as a discourse, and he refers to it as a gospel that calls for the like for the end of discourse. He wants to say something like that. So it's a very elusive passage. I could pull it up for you if you wish. I was thinking actually, by the way, that it would make the most sense for us to if we truly wanted to continue this study of 16, to move on to 17 quickly so that while it's fresh in our minds, because 17 is a much more, I think from a pedagogical standpoint, a much more fulfilling seminar, precisely because the math themes are put to such logical use that finally they are free from a purely pedagogical function, but now they become demonstrative, meaning that now you, the student, can use the math themes. We can apply them in some sense, right? So it's always and then it's a very rewarding exercise to begin to, and I think as for any Lacanian, it's important that you memorize how they function as best that you can. As a side point, I was once in a seminar with Zizek, and he was demonstrating the 4 discourses on the board, but he forgot them, and he felt very bad. It was so funny. Some student had to correct him, and then that student, of course, happened to be our friend Gabriel Tupanamba, and that was the beginning of Slavoj Žižek's first real respect and admiration for Gabriel at that moment, because Gabriel kind of saved him. But still, nonetheless, it would be useful for us to continue working on 17. Maybe not working on it in the same rigorous way we've done 16, but perhaps doing a few sessions on the math themes, refreshing ourselves with them. When I had started the study groups a few years ago, we had a great presentation on them that I can share the link to the video if anyone's interested. That would just be an idea. Let's start this because again, it's quite long. Let me share my screen. Any final comments between this back and forth, please jump in while I share. Okay. Would somebody be willing to kick us off? It's possible. Yeah. Okay. Yes. So he begins by this conversation regarding the title of From Another to the Other. And he basically arrives at this recapitulation regarding what the core logic of From One to the Other is about. It's important that we read it, even though it's a review, precisely because he introduces this concept of the mark of the trait. Would anybody be willing to kick us off reading? Perhaps Matan, you might, yes?
Yeah, sure thing.
I
I
saw
have
you
a
unmuted.
dog barking in the back, so please pardon that.
Sure.
How to generate surplus jouissance logically. This is meeting 23. He begins with this little weekly festival not being fated to continue for all eternity. Today I'm going to try to give you an idea of the way in which, if we were in a more favorable, better structured context, we could endeavor to make the theory a bit more rigorous. When I selected the title From Another to the Other for my seminar this year, one of the people who, I must say, stands out here owing to his fine ear, but who, like St. Paul on the road to Damascus, was floored along the way by something that happened to us last year. You are all aware of it, for its memory lingers on, and found himself thrown off by his theorizing horse by a Maoist illumination. This person heard my title and said to me, "Well, it sounds banal." I would nevertheless like to point out, if you don't already suspect as much, that the title means something that necessitates my very explicit choice of these words, which are written as I dare to hope you see them in your mind's eye, from an other to the other. On several occasions this year, I have written capital A on sheets of paper on which I remind you from time to time of the existence of certain graphs. and the other involves what I write with a lowercase a. One might have thought that these terms no longer resonated in the flabbergasted ear by any other sound than that of a little melody by which to stroll, like from one to the other, taking a stroll. Yet, to say from one to the other isn't insignificant. It stresses a displacement from here to there. Those of us who are not itching at every moment to take action can wonder why talking about two ones might be of interest. If the other is still a one, why not, or pardon me, why one more than the other? There is a certain prepositional use of the terms, plural, one and other, which are inserted between a from and a to, the effect of which is to establish between them what I called at another time. You perhaps recall, at least I imagine you do, a metonymic relationship. That is what I just designated by raising the question of what interest it can be if the other is still a one. It nevertheless becomes interesting if you write it as follows, where the metonymic relationship is between two elements, each of which is one. From the one to the other, one and other having an underline with a one underneath that. It is important to write it in that way, written as numerical one. Quote, the word one is a privileged signified effect generally known as a number. This, quote, one is characterized by what is called numerical identity. Nothing is designated by these terms here. We are not at the level of some sort of unary identification. For example, that of a one that would be inscribed on the palm of your hand as a sort of tattoo with which to identify you in a certain context, as has happened. In each case here, we are talking about a line, trait that marks nothing. We are at the level of what is known as strict numerical identity, which marks pure difference insofar as nothing specifies or differentiates it. The other is other in no respect, and this is precisely why it is the other. We might wonder why there are these things lying around in from the one to the other, things known in French as definite articles. This cannot be seen very clearly at the outset in the first case. Why the one? We would be tempted to qualify the le as euphonious if we hadn't been sufficiently warned by prior experience to mistrust such explanations. Let us see if it is any better justified in the second case. The definite article in French differs from its use in English, for example, where its demonstrative accent is so strongly stressed. A main feature of the definite article in French is to highlight notoriety, le notoire, as it is known. In the phrase from the one to the other with which we began, are we talking about the other among all or the other among many? Oh, yeah, the other among many. Are we going to gently take it in that direction? Since we say among all, does that mean there are others? Yet it is worth realizing here, worth recalling, as it were, that when I wrote the other with a capital O, I also formulated that there is no other of the other. As this is truly essential to my entire discourse, I am going to have to seek some other form of notoriety for the definite article. If there is no other of the other, does that mean there is only one of them? But that too is impossible because otherwise it would not be the other of all others. All of this may strike you as a bit rhetorical. It is. People speculated a great deal in ancient times about these topics, which were spelled out a bit differently back then. People spoke about the other and the same, and Lord knows where that led, a whole lineage known as Platonic. To speak as I do of the one and the other is not the same thing. The Platonic lineage naturally could not do otherwise than end up raising the question of the one. But it did so in a way that we are going to investigate in the end, in the sense of calling it into question. The, quote, one, as we take it up here at the level of numerical identity, is of a different order than the one elaborated by Platonism. It is clear to those of you who have listened attentively this year that the relationship of the one to the other is tantamount to conveying the function of the ordered pair. You observed in passing the major role played by this function in the introduction of what is bizarrely called the theory of sets. Everyone seems to adapt quite easily to sets in the plural, whereas it is a burning question which has yet to be completely resolved to know whether to make it a plural or not. The question at least remains open whether we may say that an element can belong to two different sets while remaining the same. This little aside is designed to remind you of the powerful logical innovation constituted by everything related to what I will call ensemblissement, a play on ensemble, set, and établissement, establishment. I like this term better than ensemblement at the same time for its consonants, even though from time to time it happens that set theory gets bogged down or stuck in the sand, say ensemble, yet it reassembles itself, se reensemblit, quite easily. In reference to set theory, I would like to highlight in passing the radical innovation constituted by the fact that it introduces, and literally right from its very inception, the notion that we must not conflate any specific element with the set that has it as its only element. They are not at all the same thing. This step in logical innovation can serve us as a fitting introduction to our problematic other, about which I just questioned why we would grant it the notorious value of calling it the other, using the definite article. The other, in the sense in which I am introducing it, provided with a capital O, takes on notoriety, not because it is the other among all, nor because it is the only one, but because there might not be an other at all, and simply an empty set in its stead. That is what designates it as the other. This may remind you of the schema I have written on white sheets of paper several times this year, in order to designate the relationship between the S1 and an S2, the latter being the other signifier of the subject in the sense that the S1 represents the subject to another signifier.
Okay, so that's really good. Thank you so much. Let's see. Akshay had a hand up. Would you like to jump in?
It's a very small point, but I just thought the from an big other to the other, like to the cycle as opposed to a one-directional process. Like, I mean, I think it's a movement, like, an other suggests like, oh, this is the symbolic law of some given society, like the way the chapter he keeps on saying, oh, this civilization, that civilization. As opposed to something that's structural, that is sort of that the other as such, conceptually speaking, doesn't exist, which isn't about a particular tradition. And I think, yeah, that again has something to do with his take on quote unquote modernity or capitalism.
Thank you so much. I was going to say before we go to Matilda, how this section here at 358 reminds me a great deal of Alain Badiou's being an event in this notion of like the state of the situation, right? As Badiou develops it, it's very obvious to me that I think this this Lacanian turn to set theory is sort of what was in the air as Badiou is formulating all of that. Anyways, go ahead, Matilda.
I think I just wanted to flag a few things, like the Platonic tradition thought in terms of same and other. And it seems like in this seminar, we play more with like difference and repetition. And especially with the one and the little a and their relationship, he earlier identifies the one as repetition and the a as difference. And I just wanted to flag that earlier he does kind of gesture towards this and kind of develops it here, that like the a is there from the beginning. So like difference is there in the beginning. And I think what he's trying to do with this talk about like the element and then the element and the set are not the same thing is like you have basically like an identity that has a difference in it, but just like there's something here like from the very beginning, identity, or I'm sorry, difference and repetition are like combined together more or less.
Thank you so much. Yes, Louise.
So I found fascinating how we miss something in translation, because in French the un autre, right? The un is both and the indefinite article, and it also means one, right? Like in Spanish, it's also the same. So you can say we don't say in English like one newspaper, like, and you don't say the same. It's not the same as say a newspaper, right? You have different ways of saying that. but in Spanish at least, it's the same, un periódico. And I think in French it's the same, right? So it is these two meanings, right? Because when Lacan talks about an other, he means like the first an other that is indefinite. It's not only that it's indefinite, but it's a one, right? So it's one other. So it's one, right? And I think it must be understood with the other meaning that is indefinite, because it means to this beyond one, right? The beyond other, that is, like, remember last session we read about the different gods, right? That there could be different gods among different societies, right? So, but what is the one of all these gods, right? So it's indefinite. That's the god of the beyond, right? And this movement from this god of the beyond, the one, right, of the beyond, to determine it, right, the other, right, is to desecrate this sacred beyondness, right? And it's just so this move to the other, right, it means that it is just, something determined, as he is going to explain. Is just the empty set, right? Itself is the set itself, let's put it that way. It's not the content by the set itself that can be determined as the other, right? Not the content of this supreme one, right? Yeah. So
Yeah, that's very helpful. Yeah, that makes sense. Matilda, do you want to add to this?
Oh, I was just going to briefly mention the Fibonacci sequence is what's essential here is that, like, in this, he said like something about the Fibonacci sequence that's like in the simplest function of numbers, in this like most primary operation, like the A is there from the beginning. And so like in this like almost like beginning to count, the A is present. And in the Platonic tradition, it came across my mind a problem that they had, the Pythagoreans, who Plato is building on. One of the issues they had was the irrational number when dividing the scale, the musical scale, and they hid the irrationality of that. And they were very much about repressing the irrationality within the division of the string into a scale. And anyway, there's just something interesting there.
Andrew, please. Andrew, did you want to jump in real quick? You are on mute. Oh, that's okay. Yes. Okay, well, for the purpose of time, I think we should continue to go through these preliminary remarks. If you are up for it to continue to read, Matan, we would obviously love that. I am a big fan of your reading, but if not, that's fine. We can find another.
Oh, no, yeah. I'm glad to continue.
Although Andrew is back now, did you want to make a quick comment, Andrew, before we start again? You're muted. Sorry. Okay. Let's see if we can figure this out. Okay, in that case, we'll wait, Andrew. We're just gonna read and then we'll come back to you. All right.
Okay, so if any of you haven't had the chance to look at figure 23.1, it's right there, and I'm gonna start following the paragraph after. The S1 is placed here outside of a circle, A, which precisely designates the limit of the field of the other as empty set. The S2 is written in the field of the other. This is what designates the relationship between the S1 and the S2. I also emphasize that the limit of A, which is, let me repeat, the empty set, is renewed with S3 and as many other signifiers that may come afterward, serving as a kind of relay. We are going to explore this relay today. I have provided this reminder for those of you who might not see what I am going to designate because you were absent when I wrote those formulas in this way. Note that there is nothing arbitrary about identifying the limit traced out by the line here with the same repeated letter A, for it is hardly the strangest facet of set theory that when you investigate a set, you can at any moment bring out the empty set as a subset, as they say, of it. Regardless of the level at which it is produced, it is the same empty set. You are immediately going to be able to picture this very simply. Let us posit a set constituted by the element 1, and by the set whose only element is the element 1. This gives us a set with two distinct elements, since we cannot in any way confuse an element with the set that contains only that element. And here we have in curly braces 1, as well as embedded within that, right next to that 1 is another 1 inside of curly braces. The play of so-called subsets is quite interesting in set theory, and perhaps indeed constitutes its main interest. I'm sorry to have to provide the following reminder, but the ever larger number of people attending here obliges me to do so. Let us make X, Y, Z, and N representing different entities the elements of set E. Included in set E is another set known as a subset, which is the following X, Y, Z. There are other subsets as well, and the number of them grows quite quickly. There's the subset whose elements are X, Y, N, the subset Y, Z, N, and so on and so forth. I need not, I think, stress this any further for it to be quite obvious to you. At first glance, the subsets might seem to be parts or members of the initial set, if they are nothing of the kind. It is clear that the number of subsets of the set E from which we began in order to articulate them is absolutely not equal to the number of elements in that set, namely 4, but goes well beyond it. It is even easy to imagine the exponential formula that gives the number of a set's constructible subsets as the number of elements in the set grows. It is very important to remember this in order to shake up our belief in a supposedly natural geometry, and especially in a postulate which, if I recall correctly, a guy by the name of Eudoxus of Cnidus made a great deal of, discussed somewhere in Euclid's book 10. I hope I'm not mistaken. We will immediately see in passing how important this point is to us, too, by enumerating the subsets of our other. The other is reduced here to its simplest function, that of being a set bearing the 1, the signifier that is necessary since it is the one to which the 1 of the subject, or the subject as 1, the un du sujet, will be represented from the one to the other. Later, we will see within what limits it is legitimate to reduce these two S's, S1 and S2, to the same 1. That is the purport of my remarks today. And then here we have 1, and then next to it a 1 in curly braces. It is clear that by investigating the 1 inscribed in the field defined as the other as an actual set, its subsets will be the 1 and the following, which is the way in which we write the empty set. A set containing 1 and the empty set. This is the simplest illustration of the fact that the subsets of a set constitute a collection that is numerically greater than the number of elements in the set. Need I stress this further? And now we have something similar to what we just saw before, except everything is in curly braces as before, but now there's no empty set, just a space in between two curly braces. The double parentheses you see here is clearly the same line as the one that designates A, exactly identical to the A as empty set in the two places on the schema we saw earlier from figure 23.1. This reminds us that as soon as we conceptualize that something as simple as the unary trait is inscribed in the field of the other, the function of ordered pairs arises owing to the nature of sets. Indeed, two 1s can be inscribed here, which are distinguished owing to their different membership. The 1 on the left is the sole element of the initial set, which is empty prior to this inscription, whereas the 1 on the right fills the second empty set, if I may put it thusly, since as an empty set, it is the same. I'm not going to go over these anymore because he usually goes over them. Herein lies the unheralded nature of the deceptively simple from the one to the other, with which we began earlier, which served to remind us what is specific in the relation that inspired my title this year, from another to the other. For everything that constitutes our experience can merely turn, return, and forever revolve around the question of the subject's subsistence, the never to be lost sight of access and indispensable axiomatic with which we have to deal concretely in the most effective manner possible. If we do not, if this axis or axiom is not maintained, we fall into confusion. The kind of confusion we have been seeing all around us recently in everything that has been enunciated in the realm of psychoanalytic experience, especially what it includes, and in an ever more invasive way, the so-called function of the quote-unquote self, which is especially present in current articulations of Anglo-American psychoanalysis.
Okay. Andrew, did you want to jump in with your comment? Feel free. Okay, it's not allowing you to unmute. Okay, no worries. Um, okay, so I mean, I take this final comment here as a repetition of Lacan's long-standing criticism of ego psychology, right? Where there's sort of a lack of dialectical application of thinking the subject. There, yeah, so that seems fairly straightforward to me. All of these other points, I think, will warrant some commentary once we dig deeper into the lesson here.
Can you
So I
hear me
propose.
now?
Yeah, now we do.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. Sorry about that. Hi, everybody. Yeah, not big comment, just very interesting to me in that what he's doing here is breaking down how to understand the relationship of the subject to the big other insofar as we're assuming there is no one big other. We're in a new era, I think, than we are in Freud's era, where we could say there was like a common, generally a common repression of the name of the father in a certain way across different societies.
I think I understand what you're saying. Does this have to do with what Lacan talks about, like the rise of segregation?
When what we mean here is not a kind of sociological, simple way of understanding how everyone is identifying with the same sort of logic of beliefs or unconscious code of behavior, et cetera, et cetera. So he's opening the door, which is very interesting, I think, to how to work with set theory in a way that we're still thinking about that the big other is quite important in how the subject is relating to it, but it's no longer tethered, excuse me, to a common ground. I don't know if that helps, but that's just what occurred to me when I was listening to this, that it's really kind of developing psychoanalysis into a quite interesting direction that is definitely difficult. That's why I think he talks about it being confusing and why it can easily be very problematic.
Yeah, so nothing like us, you know, like we were all
Yeah.
like
That's very helpful, Andrew. I have some thoughts on that, but Luis, go ahead.
Yeah, I share the same idea. I think what Lacan sees important is not the fact that there is an other, right? Or what the other knows, at least in this section, but how do we classify the other, right? As being whole, right? The whole problem in history is of understanding this oneness, right? As being complete and whole, right? So this is what he's challenging. What is this one, right? And then we can even see that as you said, right? Even with Freud, with ego psychology, right? They still maintain the idea of an ego that is complete, that is one, right?
I mean, it's true. Although Lacan obviously has, as he will develop here, the sense that the modern situation of the subject from Hegel onward, or even you could say from Pascal onward, is a two. The subject as two. The subject as divided, but the subject is divided off of an imaginary one, or off of an imaginary appeal to a oneness, which which will have some type of determined or inevitable um, confrontation with its own splitness or with its own inconsistency. I think the air of ego psychology, or the air of even this historical, although it is true that later in the seminars of Lacan, he gets to talking much more about Freud's time in distinction to our time. I think in this instance, he's talking about modernity as such, because he's invoking Pascal and Hegel. So he's not so much talking about that particular mutation in the psychoanalytic field from Freud to now, in my view. But anyways, go ahead, Luis. Or actually,
Yeah, yes,
you
just to
already
comment
went?
what you said.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, because even with Lacan, there is like some Lacanians that have this Kantian twist to Lacan. Said, this divided subject is the epistemological limit, right? We don't know about ourselves, right? We don't know everything about ourselves, right? What Lacan is doing, I think, is an ontological claim, right? It's not that we don't know, it's that there is no one, right? And we can extrapolate the same to ego psychology. Yes, there is a limit that Freud gives, but yet they posit that there is a one in a very Kantian sense, of the thing in itself, right?
Well, right, exactly, because this whole debate between Badiou and Lacan over Lacan's affirmation that there is a oneness versus the one is not, right? That whole distinction is interesting, because I do think that um ultimately people have theorized this back into the Parmenides, and Plato and Aristotle and so on, which we could talk about at a later time. Okay, we have Matan and then Akshay.
Yeah, thanks. You bringing that up, Luis, made me kind of want to raise a question about a figure we talk about often, Slavoj Žižek. I think he poses a response, and he thinks the solution is to take place, or at least in terms of what he says, is kind of maybe a more like relaxed, perhaps like a demand of reputation in public speech. He has something he says quite often where he's like, okay, well, we're all illegitimate, we're all shitty, maybe now we can have like a real conversation or whatever. And I think I contrast that to maybe the Lacanian school and the attitude of Lacan himself, where he seems to have more of a fidelity to like the clinic as a clinic, not just as something that can be like expanded. And particularly with regards to like the responsibility of the subject, their ability to kind of stand at a lawful distance and analyze their own actions. So I'm wondering if we have any maybe improvisations that we can come up with regarding the differences between these two, and where one might feel a responsibility as a clinician here.
Yeah, that is interesting, because the position of the Slovene school is to be outside of the clinic entirely. So you're asking, what does that imply in the philosophical field of alterity, which is the field of the study of the other, or otherness, right? That's a big question we should definitely think about. Yeah, because they're not necessarily trying to foster an institution in the same way as a clinical institution, right? So that's something to think about. Andrew maybe has a thought on that.
Poor Andrew, he's stuck in the purple realm.
Maybe we should just go back to reading then, if it's okay. Where did we leave off?
The bottom
We're
of
right here
page,
too.
yeah.
Start of
Right here.
two, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Would anyone care to continue? Feel free to jump in.
Happy to read a bit.
Okay, great. Matilda, please.
The difference between one, the signifier that represents the subject, and two, the signifier in relation to which it, though, will be inscribed in the field of the other, so that the subject of this very representation can emerge, is based, as you see, on a dissymmetry. What initial steps does that allow us to take? This fundamental dissymmetry allows us to raise a question. What is the status of the other? Does he know? I'm not asking you to respond with one voice, but why, after all, wouldn't you tell me the following? No, he does not know. Everyone knows that. The subject's supposed to know, bang, bang, he's done. If I had before me 2 rows of students of a certain type, who I fortunately don't have to consider to be typical, but that I can still call amusing, they would say just that. For there are still plenty of people who believe it, and even teach it in places that are unexpected, even if they only came into being recently. But that's not at all what I said. I didn't say that the other doesn't know. Those who say so don't know much about it, in spite of all my efforts to teach them. I said that the other knows. This is obvious since it is the place of the unconscious. Yet the other is not a subject. The negation in the formulation, there is no subject supposed to know, assuming I've ever said it in that negative form, bears on the subject, not on the knowledge. It is, moreover, easy to grasp if you've had a bit of experience with the unconscious, for it is characterized by the fact that we don't know who it is in there that knows. That can be written at least 2 different ways in French. Qui sait, qui sait? Qui sait, qui sait? Who it is that knows who it is. French is a very beautiful language, especially when you know how to use it. As in every other language, double entendres aren't produced in it at random. In my symbolism, the status of the other is written capital S, A in parentheses, which designates the signifier of the other which I characterize today as the empty set. I am specifying this because I would not like it if, owing to the no holds barred style with which I earlier assumed you would reply, I am obviously obliged to imagine questions and answers here, that the other does not know. You got it in your head that I am in the process of explaining to you what is found in the upper left-hand corner of my graph, namely S barred A, which is something else, the signifier of the barred other. As we will have 2 more classes this year, I'll have time to explain the difference to you. SA, capital A, is what I just enunciated here regarding the status of the other as empty set. This means that the other is in no wise one. It is not because there is no other, or there aren't any others, that the other is one. I'll read that again. It is not because there is no other that the other is one. I will assume, for the time being, that there is no confusion regarding a certain number of my notations. I am very slowly concluding that this is the case, but it is important to mention for reasons I will perhaps give you a glimpse of at the end of our meeting today. Did I really have to return to it yet again, when I have been speaking about nothing but that since the beginning? Still, I haven't yet seen proof that I have no need to return to it. In order for the subject to come from the outside and get himself represented in the other, he must thus find one other signifier. He can only find it there. The source of the confusion is the painful necessity that makes it such that he must start from elsewhere. Not for no reason, of course. I cannot retrace his history for you every time, namely how this animal with a fire lit under it ends up needing to establish itself as a subject in the other. It is quite clear that it is the fire lit under it that incites it to do so. The fire lit under it is the only thing that interests you, yet I must be able to speak to you from time to time about what happens, leaving aside the fire, which is nevertheless, of course, the only thing that can incite he who I called an animal to get himself represented in this way. In this perspective, we must thus begin, not from the other, but from this one other, the one of the signifier, or the signifier as the one, inscribed, the one in the other, the one of the signifier inscribed in the other, which is a necessary condition for the subject to be connected to it. And I find occasion as well not to recall the precondition of this one, in other words, the other. Well, I'm not sure you saw it coming, but I spoke to you about Pascal and his wager at the beginning of the year. It was not merely to demonstrate an erudition that I, moreover, hid altogether as usual, concerning my Jansenist affinities and other such journalistic idiocies. That is not exactly what is at stake. It is, rather, to study what happens on the basis of what I just wrote on the board, regarding which you should be at least 3/4 of an hour ahead of me. What happens is that something must announce the subject prior to it becoming connected to the one other. This something is there in the simplest form, that of the same unary one to which, in the strictest of terms, we reduce what it can connect up with in the field of the other. I wrote the simplest mode of this on the board today, the mode of the subject himself counting himself as one. I must admit that it is tempting. It is even so tempting that there isn't a single one of you who doesn't do it. Despite all the psychoanalysis that has been dumped on your heads, there's nothing to be done about it. You will believe yourselves to be one for a long time. It must be admitted that you have a very strong reason for doing so. The mention of this one would instead make me vacillate and perhaps fall, even though I'm not talking right now about mentality, cultural context, or other such trash, into the lamentable weakness of mentioning a fact that, in any case, you are incapable of understanding, because I am too. There are places in the world where the goal of religion is to avoid this one other. And yet, that involves such a different way of behaving toward the divinity that we cannot even say, like Pascal did, that we don't know what God is, or even if he is. We cannot say so, for, according to a Buddhist, that would already be saying too much about the divinity. It presupposes a discipline that is obviously required, based on the consequences that result therefrom, as you nevertheless suspect, and the relations between truth and jouissance. They spray some kind of DDT on the field of the other, which obviously allows them to do certain things that we cannot allow ourselves to do. The logic that arose among them at a certain moment in history, parallel to what Aristotle cooked up for us, must nevertheless bear some relation to what I'm telling you here. It would be amusing to see that relation. The preparation of the dish takes on a different form. Their logic is not so bad. It is full of things that have not yet been put to use, or not have yet to be put to use. And instead of there simply being a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion, there are at least 5 terms. Still, in order to grasp it, you have to begin by doing a number of exercises that allow you to establish a different relationship between truth and jouissance than the one we usually find in a civilization that revolves to so great an extent around its neurotics. Owing to that, the following is at stake. It is insofar as he is initially inscribed as urinary signifier that the subject announces himself to this one other, who is there, in the other, and with respect to which he must posit himself as one. There is a sort of double or nothing here for the subject. You thus see the import of my take on Pascal's wager, which also involved just one gambler, since the other, as I emphasized, is not a gambler, but rather the empty set. The other knows things, but since he is not a subject, he cannot gamble. Pascal articulates very clearly what is involved in this double or nothing. He even says that what is at stake is simply to have a second life after our first, and that this is worth everything. That impresses us, and As we are a civilization with neurotics at our core, we buy it. We believe it. Indeed, we believe it wholeheartedly. I believe it like you believe it. It would be worth checking this life to receive another. Why? Because that would allow us to add them together, to make two. And we are all the more likely to win since there's no other choice. I'm not sure you grasp to what degree that what I'm saying coincides with a little schema found somewhere in the remarks made on the presentation by so-and-so, remarks on Daniel Lacroix's. The schema is that of a mirrored relationship with the field of the other, precisely constituted by the relationship to the ideal. To establish this ideal, it suffices to prop it up with the unary trait. The latter has a decisive impact, as the rest of the schema shows, on the way little a, which I situated in a place that allows it to be reflected in the mirror in the right manner, links up with it. In this figure, I'm clearly forced to instate little a as completely given, but this was merely a stage of the explanation, for what is at stake is to know from whence emerges this a, which is closely related to the urinary trait in the other, insofar as it is the basis of what, in the schema, takes on its import as ego ideal.
Okay, so we should stop here for a moment because I think this obviously connects us back to the debate that we have repeating and repeating over narcissism and Lacan's frustration with the mainstream IPA psychoanalytic establishment, which he perceives as not understanding his treatment of ego ideal. So in this framework, he's referring back to the constitution of the mirror stage as like the theory of the object A as that trait, which is the kind of like the blotch within the ego ideal, or the blotch within the imaginary, or the kind of stain within the imaginary, the stain within the whole. So you posit this mirror-like wholeness reflected through the paternal other, at least at this stage of the mirror stage, but that is destined to not achieve that wholeness, but nor is it capable of constituting the subject at the level of drives, because the subject at the level of drives is a polymorphous perverse subject composed of heterogeneous erogenous zones that appeal to a singular or whole other, is destined to not fully cover or fully encapsulate. But yet still there is what he calls the flame, which I think the flame, when he uses it a few paragraphs ago, means desire. So there is a desire towards a oneness, and there is therefore a naivete on behalf of ego psychology, but as well as even the reactionary Freudians, to theorize, because, you know, like in their theory of the ego ideal, it's basically this pre-death drive category, because they sort of reject the Freud after beyond the pleasure principle, right? I think that was something that Lacan never quite understands, especially for Schmergel, that one figure. And I think that's very useful because in a certain sense, they make an all too easy distinction between, I suppose that they have no account for how the subject can handle the disappointment and the dissatisfaction of not living up to the ego ideal, which is an inevitable point, other than some appeal to authority, or other than some appeal to maturity, or other than some appeal to tradition, perhaps, or something like that. And I feel that Lacan's wanting to render that picture more problematic in some ways.
Could you repeat your last point, that last little phrase?
Go ahead.
Could you just repeat that last moment of your argument there?
I was just saying that, like, in my reading of the text, for example, on the concept of ego ideal by Schmergel, the Freudian analyst that Lacan is taking on 2 or 3 sessions ago, her argument there seems to be that she calls it the malady of the ideal, so that art, politics, aesthetics, like human experience as such, in the modern period, is in a kind of crisis over the ego ideal, meaning that modern life has this, and she doesn't really have a developed theory of commodity or of commodity fetishism or of consumer capitalism, but I think she's basically suggesting that the ego ideal is actually an irrationalist issue, is an irrationalist source, but it's not necessarily tied into a logic of the drive. It's tied into a logic of primary narcissism for her. And therefore, it's tied into overcoming this a theory of the self thought of vis-a-vis stages of self-development, of maturity. And so the way out of the ego ideal is basically to renounce the to overcome the childhood yearning or flame of desire for a complete submersion into it, while at the same time recognizing, I guess you could say, a sort of stoic ethic that it will always remain a part of you and so on. And therefore, for her, she has an aesthetic theory about how to almost like contain the ego ideal in some sense, because she has a whole theory of art related to it, which is actually fairly interesting in its own right. I think it's actually decent. And I would actually say it's quite close to what Lacan is theorizing here. But Lacan has a theory of the object A, which I don't think she has. And he's capable of adding a logic of negation into this, but is also capable of presenting a theory of the subject which is non-developmentalist. And I've always struggled with that in Lacan, because I feel like my own proclivity to thinking the subject is a developmentalist one. And I've always wondered how to handle that problem in Lacan. Do you know what I mean? Because Lacan's point is not necessarily to say that, like the ego psychologists would, or, you know, that we must make appeals to some ideal grounded in the reality principle, or some ideal grounded in normativity, or some ideal grounded in limits, and so on. Anyways, yeah, I'll stop there. Go ahead, Luis.
Aren't the stages of the object A, right, and then his later objects, can we not understand that as developmental?
I don't know. I don't know, only because Lacan is so opposed. Lacan is so opposed to an integrationalist normative framework. In some sense, I read Lacan as far more antinomian in terms of his methodology. But what do you mean by stages of the object A? What exactly does this, what is that?
I mean, in Seminar 10, he has these nice graphs, like these Euler graphs, right? In which from each object, there is a different, let's say, perspective of what is A. Like in the oral stage, there is this loss of the object, right? And then in the analog stage, there is the fact of, and in Freud too, is the fact of behavior towards, pleasing the paternal figure, right? And then we have the phallic stage in which, depending on the sex, you assign yourself your role, right, of how you enjoy, right? But then we have the gaze and the voice that I mean is developmental, the fact that it cannot arise after the phallic stage, before the phallic stage, right? Like the gaze and the voice cannot arise before the phallic stage, because they are objects of desire, right, and not objects of demand that the oral and anal are, right? So I think in some way there is kind of developmental, right, of post-phallic stage objects, right? Maybe.
Yeah, I don't know. I think that's very valid. A very valid point. I suppose the difference, though, is how this becomes translated into the register of social and political commentary that we are examining in this context, which I don't see the same appeals to some kind of Lacan's claim is not that the social norm or the social contract is in abeyance or is in crisis. Is not making some appeal to stabilize psychic, the symbolic. Lacan's point is has never been, as far as I understand, that the symbolic needs to be strengthened. You know. Go ahead, Matilda.
Um, isn't there like and I don't know if Chesapeake Smirgle, if this is in the text, but it's like the anal stage is like the object that there's like an indifference towards the object, and then like in genitality, like is like sex love where there's like a specific object or something. It's like harder because it has more limitations to it. Like, and that's like kind of a part of what the ego
Right.
does, is limit the object cathexes. And
yeah, exactly.
Yes. And the problem with narcissism is that there is an anger that can develop in dealing.
Well, primary narcissism remains pre-Oedipal and it remains perverse insofar, and therefore it functions off of what she calls anality. So it reveals like a cycle of shame in its subjects. And she has this whole point about how perverse subjects like wear their anus on their face.
Yeah.
So, which is a very interesting concept. So they're kind of in a constant sort of condition of shame, repeating, of repetition. And then therefore they have no grasp on well, you could say in a certain sense, they have no means for corralling the ego ideal. The ego ideal is like this loose balloon at a party that just like floats all around the room. You see my point. So yeah, I mean, let me say, it's worth reading. I mean, I think her text is very useful to read, especially the one on the ego ideal. Not so much the one on Freud or Reich. I think that's a polemical text that is insufficient precisely because they don't have a proper grasp on Marxism. But she's no slouch when it comes to psychoanalytic theory. So read the ego ideal text. I think you gain a lot more from that. And I think it's obvious that Lacan probably was reading it too, even though he doesn't mention it, because he keeps on referencing all of these themes that she talks about. So, anyways, go ahead, Akshay.
Just to this point of developmentalism, like I don't think he's sort of endorsing like a sort of stages theory, because it points, he sort of like ridicules people who kind of I don't know, I mean, sort of go like quote unquote primitives don't have an unconscious. But I mean, that said, there's definitely some kind of gradualism, because he's like referencing civilization and very long spans of time in the development of like all of the things that he's talking about, like the scientific revolution. It does seem like a sort of a developmental process, like in the literal sort of Hegelian sense. That said, when he's talking about Buddhism, he's not going like, oh, this is a backward stage. He's like, this is a totally sort of different. I mean, again, I don't know. It raises the question when you say totally different, what do you mean by how different is it if they're all humans? But nonetheless, sort of, I mean, so there's some kind of stages in the sense of there is a sort of like logic of God, what was the word? I'm sorry, I'm kind of blanking out on the word, but I mean, like, on the other hand, like, I wonder, because there's also sort of relativist strain to it, where he's kind of still going, this civilization, our civilization, quote unquote. But I mean, personally, I always have the question of, which civilization do you mean? But sort of, so yeah, I mean, I don't know how to square both those things, but I think there is a definite developmentalist arc to the argument.
Right. No, it is. I mean, even the introduction of the logic of the object A within the field of the ego ideal itself presupposes a not necessarily a developmentalist, but it presupposes structure. And I think that a lot of the psychoanalytic establishment are not proposing a structuralist account of the self. Even the concept of the self is insufficiently structuralist, I think, in Lacan's sense. Because in order to derive a theory of the self, one misses the logic of object A. And I think the historical piece about A, as we remember from last time, is the emergence and the appearance of A, which he has a lot of very precise things to say about that historically in its appearance. Which I think you should keep that in mind when you go into 17, because in 17, that's exactly how the periodization will go. It's sort of centered on that. Let's just go quickly through these points, and then let's get back to reading because we still have a lot to go. Go ahead, Luis.
Yeah, going back to what you said, I mean, right now he's talking about how the A emerges, right? And its connotation with the ego ideal, right? In the structure of the mirror stage, right? It is the gaze, the ego ideal in this, structure of the scopic structure, right? And the gaze, of course, is an object of desire. It's not the object of the man. It's not an object of the man because it points to your lack of knowledge about what the other is. And what I mean developmental, because this is what I am researching, because there is a difference between the scopic drive and to which Lacan pays a lot of attention, right? We have seen in this seminar, he talks about the scopic drive, but not too much about the voice. And in the scopic drive, in seminar 10, he claims that the gaze is, and he makes in the graphs too, it stands for the might of the other, right? While and the voice, but he doesn't give a graph. This is interesting. He doesn't give a graph for the voice, so there is this lack of knowledge about the voice. He's very scopic centric, right? And also we can see that in the mirror stage because he has this structure that is very scopic. The voice, on the contrary, is you don't know the desire of the other, right? So I think there is this kind of development because we can say, okay, the gaze and the voice stand for the same thing, but I don't think they stand for the same thing because the voice that it established with the superego, right, can only be resolved as ego ideal by lowering the the understanding of the superego, right? So not to know what the other wants from us, right? And yeah, so I think there is this development there, and in seminar 10 he gives this development of how we relate to the other and with A, right? And how also the subject is acknowledge itself as divided, right? Because at the beginning I think it is the other that is divided because it is the other that to whom this object A is lacking, right? Because the baby and the mother is one. So if someone is lacking, the object is the mother, the other, right? And yeah, and that doesn't happen in the anal stage, right? So yeah, I think there is kind of development, and maybe Lacan is not aware of it, right? Maybe he says something that he's not completely aware of it.
Well, also, we should keep in mind that Lacan will develop a distinction between ego ideal qua imaginary and ideal ego qua symbolic, which is articulated in a nice book of secondary literature in Lacanian field by Raoul Mancoya called The Emptiness of Oedipus. That is a book on the theory of identification in Lacan, where those two logics are quite nicely theorized. Even some political and social things are theorized there in a nice way that I would recommend to people.
Can
Go
I
ahead.
do a quick word? I mean, he has been for the last few lessons referring to this paper on identification, the one called Remarks on Daniel Lagash's presentation. I've been trying to read that. I didn't finish it before the class today, but he takes directly on the idea of like genetic explanations and structural, and the ego psychologists like thinking of the ego as a means of recognition rather than as something that generates misrecognition. And I have just a small quote that is on the nose of what we're talking about. At the crux of the true resistance, we have to deal with an psychoanalyst convoluted theoretical discussions of the ego lies the simple refusal to admit that the ego's rightful status in analytic theory is the same as it stains in practice, a function of misrecognition. The resistance is based on the fact that we clearly have to know something about reality in order to survive in it, and that it is obviously in practice that the experience that accumulates in the ego, especially in the preconscious, provides us landmarks that prove to be the surest for survival. But we forget. And shouldn't we be surprised that it is analysts who forget it? That this argument founders when what is at stake is the effects of the unconscious. Now, these effects extend their influence to the ego itself. Indeed, Freud introduces this theory of relations between the ego and it expressly to assert this. Thus, to extend the field of our ignorance, not of our knowledge. Basically, it's saying like the ego is involved in the distortion rather than in this reality principle purely, and like this accumulation of experience that like leads to recognition and kind of like mastery. I think there's a lot we skipped over in this section too, that is related to the subject, but is like far more formalized and abstract. Like he's talking about like identification here and what we've been reading with like, okay, the subject is like talked about before they're born, like they are given like traits or unary traits or marks or whatever, and then as the human evolves or whatever, and they communicate with the other or something, like the signifiers are coming, somehow they're coming from the other and going back into it, and we have this strange topology. I know that was a horrible summarization, but there is a lot in this section too. I mean, we do probably need to keep going, but
no, you're right. You're right, because I think that the diagrammatic representation of metonymy as portrayed in the figure we saw above really makes the most sense to me when we think about that of vis-a-vis what occurs in free association on the couch. Not so much what occurs in the mirror stage, which is what you're talking about. Although in a very interesting way, you could apply it in both fields. I suppose it could work. Anyways,
never read the
okay.
mirror stage paper. Everyone says I'm referring to the mirror stage when I've never read it. I don't know.
Oh no, well you are though.
Okay,
I mean that is the foundation of all of this, which should be, I think, clear it is. Okay, where were we at here? Where were we at? Would somebody remind me? 315 somewhere. Or are we down farther? Sorry.
well, I
Oh
don't
yeah,
know.
yeah. Sorry, no, down here. Sorry. Okay, yes.
Haven't you noticed that what is the
Oh
bit
yeah,
about
okay,
Hegel?
thank you. Okay. Haven't you noticed that what is at stake in the double or nothing is also found in a certain text about which I've been speaking to you for a long time, so long that some of you must all the same have opened it up already, namely Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. To reintroduce the little story of master and slave with its somewhat overly dramatic charge, in this way allows us to isolate the crux of the proof, as it were, Hegel was writing at a time when Germany was altogether shaken up in the wake of people who, fortunately, represented something else. Soldiers commanded by someone who was rather clever, who had no need to come to my seminar to know how he needed to operate politically in Europe. So, master and slave, the struggle to death of pure prestige, he really knocks our socks off with that. You see the point that he makes there is that uh, if 68 was successful, then Lacan would not have, you would not be with me. This is what he's saying. You see the point? Because the revolution was successful. He's talking about Bonaparte. Anyways, it's a little side point. Lacan's the master only in the wake of the failed revolution. Go ahead, Matan.
Thanks. I'd like to defend Hegel a little bit here, and maybe agree with something that Zizek says, where Lacan is most correct about Hegel, where he's I don't know, trying to oppose himself to him. I mean, if you actually read the section in the Phenomenology of Spirit on the Lord and Bondsman, to me, I mean, maybe it was a different experience for all of you, but it comes and goes quite quickly. And the point that Hegel says is that the dialectical moment of, I don't know, uncertainty that was kind of plaguing his explanations of perception, understanding, consciousness, it's perhaps like a central, I don't know, organizational principle which exceeds the two parties and unites them in the form of I guess a material basis for a commonly disavowed relationship to some sort of material means of reproduction, which they both share, yet they both must disavow in order for their kind of opposition to make sense. And in doing so, he kind of moves on to the singular subject of Stoicism, which you mentioned earlier. And he begins to talk about the step from Stoicism to the famous skepticism of Sextus Empiricus. Sorry. But which I do think, I think it really totally ties into what he's trying to say here.
Yeah, no, it is true. I mean, you have to ask yourself why the lordship in bondage moment. If the phenomenology is a retelling of phenomenological freezing points of the development of a grand stagist theory of consciousness or forms of collective consciousness, why have scholars spent so much attention on lordship in bondage? Why have they extracted that as the sine qua non of the condition of modern life? Why is that condition isolated and so much thought is imbued into it? It's not only because Marxists have done so. You know, there's something deeper there at work. I think you could say that perhaps for Hegel it becomes the antithesis to the system of ethical life, right? So it's yeah, although as you say, there's many other moments that people ignore, you know, in this saga of the phenomenology. Anyways, let's continue on. By the way, the one that I love the most is, of course, the section on the romantic reformer, which the other big obsession is, of course, the beautiful soul. But my analyst, Wilfred Verrecke, has brought to our attention that in his work on psychosis, that the romantic reformer in Hegel's phenomenology actually gives us, I guess you could say, a more apt, imminent critique of revolutionary desire than does the beautiful soul. I have a lecture from him in my channel you can look at on this if you're interested. Okay. Okay, now to reintroduce the little story of master and slave with its, okay, we already read that. Hegel was da-da-da. Okay. There is no struggle to the death since the slave doesn't die. Otherwise, he couldn't serve as a slave. See, this is also part of the reason that it's talked about so much is because there's a lot of misreadings of it, right? Okay. There is no need for struggle, whether to the death or not. One need but think, and regarding this struggle, to think means that, yes, indeed, if you have to do it, you do it. One constitutes a unary trait with what is, after all, the only thing, if you think about it carefully, with which a living being can do so, with someone who is alive. In that way, things are clear. You'll only have one life in any case. Deep down, everybody knows it, but that does not stop there from being but one interesting thing, which is to believe that you have an infinity of lives, and that these lives are, moreover, destined to be infinitely happy. God only knows who made such a promise and why. We shall try to elucidate that. You could almost say that what Lacan is driving at here is that Pascal's wager needs to be grafted onto Hegel's master-slave dialectic, because what Hegel adds to Pascal is the alterity question of the wager, how there's a mutual context of struggle and exploitation in which the wager occurs, you could say. That's why I think this section is called Hegel with Pascal or something like that, right? It must really have been quite something to be Pascal, exclamation point. What he wrote on those little scraps of paper not intended for publication has a certain structure that converges with the struggle. See, that itself is a very interesting reading of Pascal, which is only to the death insofar as it transforms one's life into a signifier limited to the unary trait. This is what constitutes pure prestige, and it is, moreover, chock full of effects that take their rightful place at the level of animals. The struggle is no more to the death in animals than it is in men. We need but consider what happens in the struggle among males that Konrad Lorenz described so well. Weekly papers are still making much of it 20 years after I showed its importance in my seminars at St. Anne Hospital, at the time of the mirror stage, and I don't know what else. The migratory locust and the stickleback. When people asked what is a stickleback, I drew them a picture. Sticklebacks and other species don't necessarily kill each other, they intimidate each other. Lorenz showed us astonishing things on that score. What happens among wolves, for example? A male wolf that's intimidated offers up his throat to be bitten by the threatening wolf. The gesture suffices. The other male has no need to rip his throat out. Yet the victorious wolf does not thereafter believe he is two wolves. The speaking being, on the other hand, believes he is two, namely, as they say, master of himself. That is the pure prestige that is created in this business. Were there no signifier, you could never imagine such a thing, right? This is what I meant by this positing of the one, right? That is Lacan's structuralist reading of Hegel through the Kojevian thing, because, famously, Kojev's lectures on Hegel's phenomenology center this as the central concept, that it is a battle for pure prestige to the death, for the establishment of pure prestige. Which, of course, many commentators have pointed out that this, if you look at Alain Badiou's wonderful lectures called The Century on the passion for the real, is a wonderful encapsulation of the passion for the real itself, which is itself is a very 20th century passion for the real. To read Hegel's this way, right? Like, what would Brandom say regarding the Kojevian theory of prestige? That would be interesting for somebody to look at Brandom's Spirit of Trust on the phenomenology, to see the contrast that is at stake here, because it's a completely different theory of desire. In this sense, the theory of desire of Kojev is almost like Fanonian in how violent it is, how total it is, right? And Lacan is picking up on this. It's a very militant Marxist reading of Hegel, as far as I can see. It is enough to talk to anyone at all to realize that at a minimum, he believes himself to be two. That's because the first thing someone always tells you is that if things hadn't happened the way they did, they would have been otherwise. And they would have been so much better because they would have corresponded to his true nature, to his ideal. This, I think, is an important point he makes here. The exploitation of one man by another begins at the level of ethics, except that we see more clearly what is at stake at the level of ethics. In other words, that it is the slave who is the master's ideal. It is the slave who brings the master what he needs, his one extra. That is the ideal. Scrupulously performed services. Yeah. The slave, therefore, is being put into work for the master's prestige. Therefore, the slave's prestige is occluded or is not capable of being posited. And then in the end of that dialectic, the master ends in a kind of, well, there must be revealed some kind of scandal of that, right? Because there's something about the, well, go ahead, Luis, jump in.
So when I think when he says that the slave is a master's ideal, in Seminar 17 he talks how the master is idiotic, right? He just demands things, but he doesn't know anything at all, right? He doesn't know anything at all of what he has, right? While the slave is the one that works and knows, has the know-how, right? And not only the know-how of the things that the master has, but the slave has the know-how of the master's desire, right? And I think that was very, very interesting, right? That the slave knows the desire of the master, while the master is, like, of course, he's an idiot. He doesn't know anything, right? Therefore, the slave is his ideal because he has this knowledge about the master that the master doesn't know. And I think in that sense, it makes sense that he says that is his ideal, right? In the term of knowledge.
Actually,
please, yes, thank you, Luis.
Yeah, no, I mean, I was by what Luis said. I'm not if you are familiar with P.G. Wodehouse, but he has like Jeeves and Wooster. And again, maybe it was as an image, it was very similar to. But I mean, I read the slave is the master's ideal in the quite literal sense that like the master desires something, an ideal situation, which the slave both sort of completes, and more practically, the master's ideal situation is having slaves, because that is, I mean, it's quite literally access to surplus enjoyment because he can command slaves. Yeah.
Well, exactly, because the surplus is what is at stake. It's the extra. That's the prestige. And it is that extra which is in the purview of the slave's labor, but also within the slave's knowledge, right? And I think this is the key point of the saga here. Andrew, go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me? Can you
We
guys
can.
hear me? Okay,
Yep.
great. Yeah, I think in terms of what he's referring to in the dialectic of the bondsman or the master and the slave is just to keep it really concrete. What Hegel was first really talking about is that the slave is in the position of unfreedom, but they actually have as knowledge as much as anyone. So let's just break it down to like a plantation situation. So you have head slaves, I mean, concretely, you have head slaves, you have all kinds of slaves, and they are the ones who actually know how to work the land. They are the ones who are actually working the land. So they are going to have knowledge over time as they grow. They're intelligent as anyone else, obviously. So they're going to figure out how one should farm well, how one should pick cotton, how one can, depending upon, I suppose, your natural proclivities to being able to think in a different abstract levels, whatever, that's universal. That has nothing to do whether or not you are born into inheriting a plantation or you're born into, unfortunately, being a slave. So in either case, you have as much access to understanding the situation as anyone, is I think what Hegel is positing here. So the unfreedom is that person is, for purely oppressive reasons, is not able to do much with it other than to constantly serve the surplus value and surplus jouissance of the master, whereas they have as much knowledge, if not more, than the master, who may, we don't want to make this too simplistic. The master might have knowledge. So let's not get it too like cookie cutter. In historical terms, Engels, for example, was a master. He owned a factory. So to say that he didn't know what workers are doing is a little silly. He knew what they were doing in his factories. But the point is more to say that the workers have a certain knowledge of how things actually work. They can understand the situation as much as anyone. So I'm repeating myself. But the point that of the dialectic, I think that where Lacan is driving at here is that it's not necessarily a fight to death. It's a kind of a fight with, in a sense, the relationship between the objet what we call ideology in capitalism now, where there's this kind of assumption of I'm reaching here a little bit, but Freakonomics, neoliberalism, there's all kinds of assumptions of normalcy of what, ideologically speaking, of what we're supposed to do, like values in a humanistic level are very strongly enforced in our society today as to how to function well as a regular person with an ego or what have you. So I think that's why, just one last note, when he was talking for a moment about that it breaks down to subsistence, because in a certain sense it does. How is this person that's coming into a clinic to talk about what's ailing them at the level of psychological issues, not just physical, but something that's being repeated that they don't fully understand? Why do they talk to a therapist? It's because there's a repetition of something they don't fully understand. And so what they're trying to figure out is still, though, relates to their issues of subsistence. So so in that sense, it's very material. It's very grounded ultimately in questions of class relations, class structure, dynamics within our current political order, et cetera. That's all I wanted to know.
Yeah. No, it's really good. I mean, I think in a certain sense, like for Hegel, the master-slave dialectic is a repetitive cycle that would determine social life in a less refined ethical modality, right? In a regressive ethical society. So such that it becomes a site for that which must be transcended. And what Lacan is drawing attention to is that this exists within the animal kingdom, but the difference is that animals are not purveyors of ego ideals or of surplus signifiers, which is the side of the knowledge of the jouissance, which is that he says later in a moment that Hegel doesn't talk about. So this concept that he's getting from Kojève of the prestige object, which becomes the center of the drama of the master-slave dialectic, is what is unique about human existence and communication in some sense. But I think for Hegel, it's a lower form of sociality, especially if you read the System of Ethical Life, which is a kind of posthumous manifesto in a way written after the phenomenology. It's clear that this condition, and of course there's Karatani's incredible point that Marx, according to Karatani, did not see modern capitalism and its direction after 1848 as composed of a sociality based in the master-slave dialectic. He says that that's actually what Karatani says this in his book Transcritique. He says that was a vulgar left Ricardian view that would understand capitalism as still retaining this struggle when it actually has transcended it. And therefore, the workers' movement made an error by understanding social conflict vis-a-vis the master-slave dialectic. And then he blames Engels for that. Anyways, okay. Go ahead, Akshay.
I wouldn't blame Engels, but I kind of agree with that. Like, and I guess in so much as I mean, I was thinking about what Andrew was saying, and sort of yes, the slaves have knowledge, but from an aristocratic perspective, it's precisely labor is beneath me, right? Like to have knowledge is to be a sort of servile being, is to be an artisan, it's someone who sells their labor in order to live. Whereas this is a kind of like the aristocratic, kind of ethos would be a kind of like uh I don't know. I mean, that I don't work. Whereas, like, I mean, when we're talking about modern workers and the category of like abstract labor, I think we're in a very different territory than the master-slave dialectics. I would sort of agree that
Yeah,
he's sort of
exactly.
my.
Because it is a logic that is against Marx's capital because Karatani thinks that it relies on a personalization of exploitation. And this is not the basis of how exploitation works in capitalism. Hmm? Although romantic anti-capitalists, such as Nietzsche, would want some type of return to a society that would have an acknowledgement of rank based in this conflictual basis, right?
I mean,
So you
just
do have
about
that.
the, just
Yeah.
so to continue on that, because like I mean, and if we think about prestige, like to say that it's not on the basis of this criteria, the criteria of the slaves, but I have something that is higher. Like by sort of aspiring to prestige, it's the aristocratic attempt to kind of like uh deterritorialize, like to divinize themselves by saying, oh, I'm beyond this circle of your petty interests. But like when we're thinking about capitalism, that position is barred, right? Like that's already sort of obsolete in some sense.
Yeah, exactly. Capitalism does not necessarily necessitate a class of exploiters. Although, again, this would then become a debate around like I think that some political traditions would would argue that that's actually one of the problems of capitalism, which is that it is this notion of a kind of depersonalized exploitation. So that creates almost a kind of like acephalic or a kind of headless sense of exploitation, right? Where sovereignty is in abeyance. And so it's like this kind of weird, almost like Marquis de Sade form of suffering, which no longer is relying on a kind of sovereign or it's like a very strange thing. Anyways, Luis, go ahead.
So going back to this topic of what the slave knows, right? Uh, I think that if we think that the master fought for prestige, right? Well, the slave assumed this defeat because he loved life more than he loved death, right? Or prestige, right? But later on, right after his defeat, he works, with matter, right, to gain recognition, and he's aware of that. He wants to gain recognition, while the master is unaware of that. So we can say that the master desire is unable to recognize this recognition, right? He's unable to recognize that he desires to be recognized by another one. While the slave is clear, right? If you are someone that struggles in life, you know that you want to be recognized, right? It's crystal clear to you, right? Everything that you do is to gain
Yeah,
social
yeah.
recognition, right?
Well, no. But let's be careful because this is one thing that Zizek is actually quite good on. Like you could say this is exactly like what permits Zizek to say that the liberal account of the master-slave resolution is about achievement of a society based in recognition. It is Lacan, right? Lacan allows Zizek to read Hegel master-slave without a theory of recognition. So that's how I would argue. It would take us a while to develop that, but I mean, I've actually talked and debated with him about this for hours, you know? So you see my point, Luis. I actually think that Lacan is not on the side of making the claim Because remember, he's saying something that Hegel doesn't understand about jouissance. Where does recognition fit into this for Lacan? I don't see it there.
I mean, it's the desire of the other, right? I desire the desire of the other. So that's, I mean, in his own terms, that will be recognition. He doesn't use recognition, of course. But I mean, the other thing is that in capitalism, and he doesn't mention capitalism as such, but he says in liberal societies as capitalism, right? There is no slaves anymore, right? Everybody is free to work, right? But by doing that, you exploit others and you exploit yourself too, right? And I think that is the case because we have gained such knowledge of recognition, but not recognition as such by recognition through capital, through accumulation, and so forth, right?
Okay.
So, yeah.
Okay. Let us get back to reading, but quickly we'll have Matilda and Andrew, and then we'll go back to trying to finish reading more.
The terms God of the philosophers, God of Abraham. I feel like we're returning to Pascal and these terms are in play. I think I'm beginning to think that the one other here might be like the God of Abraham, which props up the other. So there's two others and there's a relationship to them. I'm sorry this is vague, but I'm quite sure I'm reading this. Let's see, where he says, sorry. Insofar as he is initially inscribed as a unary signifier that the subject announces himself to this one other, who is there, in the other, and with respect to which he posits himself as one. We had that language that the God of Abraham like props up the God of the God of the philosophers or the other, or there's some like strange convertible relationship between them. There's probably not enough time to unravel.
Yeah, you know, you're right. There's a lot going on here. I mean, this is an incredible fusion of everything that we've been working on for the last few months. Go ahead, Andrew.
Can you guys hear me?
Oh yeah.
Okay. Just going to quickly say, I think that maybe it's a little of a misunderstanding in the sense that let's just look at the capitalist class. They don't present themselves as just hanging around and not working. That is not what they present. Whether it's Trump or Musk or Kamala Harris or anyone within the upper class echelon, they definitely present that they're hard working and smart as whips. And I use that on purpose. So their whole presentation is that they work with efficiency. The whole idea is projecting a super ego ideal that we all need to identify with. So we're not beyond bourgeois, the bourgeois revolution here. We are flat right within it. So the promotion of whether it's Bonapartism or I don't know, what do you want to call it, neo-feudalism, nonetheless, there is a class structure that is involved in projecting what the master, so to speak, is supposed to be doing if you're a good capitalist. It's not hanging around and just having sex with friends or girlfriends or boyfriends or whatever. It's you are an incredible captain of industry, et cetera, an incredible techno-brilliant genius. That is the projection. So that's not a fantasy thing. That is, I mean, it is a fantasy and a Lacanian thing, but it is actually a productive, let's say, enterprise. That's a part of our whole, cultural order. It's not, they're not lax on that. They're not saying they just golf all day. None of those people are saying that. And if they are saying,
yeah.
Then they're decadent.
No, you're right. You're right. I mean, you could say, put differently. There is an evacuation of an acknowledged agency that would be the agency responsible for the singularity or the prestige of the ruling class, which is why actually capitalism, from a standpoint of the working class, was much more adept to be contested when we had what Veblen called conspicuous consumption amongst the ruling class. In other words, once that lingering aristocratic ethos, which said, yes, the working class is the backbone of our leisure, right? They would avow that at a certain point in time, right? And, you know, most people recognize that at the end of the two wars, something mutated in capitalism, and we are in a different, structure. So the class structure is different, although, of course, I think it still is present. It's just various logics of fetishism prohibit the appearance of the class struggle. So it's still there, but what you're talking about is it's ideologically covered over. And they've just discovered that this is more, it's more effective for Bezos to concoct these narratives of
But concretely, we're talking about what we call professional manager class. So in other words, we don't have John D. Rockefeller is
right,
literally his hands on what's going on. There's a whole layer of lawyers and management and bureaucrats working the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller, enterprises, ExxonMobil, what have you may be. And that is really, we get back to structuralism here. I mean, I know people don't like to talk about structuralism, but this is pretty strictly structural stuff here. We are really in
right,
the structure of capitalism, like really Claude, Levi-Strauss here, like pretty boring. So you work your way in ExxonMobil, you then have power. You don't have power any other way. You can be any kind of sexual identity now, but you only have power in ExxonMobil by working your way up the corporate ladder. So this is
right.
structuralism here. So, I mean, really old-fashioned structuralism. Now, in
No, it's true.
what Lacan is different from structuralism, just to talk about that for a moment, is he wants to invite us, in my opinion, to constantly think beyond a sort of simplistic reduction of the subject to just the class structure. So, because we still have this problem of the objet, we still have the problem of like they aren't just completely, no one is just completely the same as whatever their status or privilege, etc., position is within the structure, which is what structuralism always argued, essentially. So that's where he's really differing it's a kind of a weird strain that's pushing for something really, in my opinion, towards the quote enlightenment, that it's possible for even an ExxonMobil guy to become a crazy rebel. Even possible for an ExxonMobil guy to suddenly become a fucking Marxist. Seriously, it's possible. Sounds crazy, but it's possible. Anyway, sorry.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. I understand where you're coming from. I think that's quite useful. Let us continue to try to make some progress. I know it's been 2 hours. We'll just maybe go for like 15 more minutes. Okay. Picking up here at 367. This makes what happens to the master at the end of history in Hegel's work much less astonishing. Oh yeah, by the way, let me just read this last sentence. It is the slave who brings the master what he needs, his one extra. That is the ideal, scrupulously performed services. This makes what happens to the master at the end of history in Hegel's work much less astonishing. It suffices to look at it to realize that the master is as thoroughly enslaved as you can get. Whence the formulation I proffered about him at a certain turning point at St. Anne that the master is history's cuckold. Of course, that term now means something different after we use cuck in the incel internet discourse. But he is cuckolded right from the outset. He is a magnificent cuckold. That is the ideal and the ego ideal, a body that obeys. See, that's very fascinating right there. That point of the ego ideal being this imaginary body, and then therefore what that body does not possess is the knowledge of what makes it possible. That's the slave, right? And naturally, he doesn't know what the slave's position is. For nothing in all of that proves that the slave does not know perfectly well that he wants what he wants right from the outset. As I very often pointed out, the question of the relations between the slave and jouissance is not at all elucidated by Hegel. Whatever the case may be, it leaves his own choice in this matter completely in the dark. After all, nothing proves that the slave has refused the struggle, or even that he was intimidated by it. If indeed this double or nothing between the one, quote, and the one, quote unquote, costs something, nothing proves that it doesn't also encroach on entirely different situations than animal situations, in which we see the possible point of connection, even though the latter is not necessarily unique. One can thus imagine a slave who views things altogether differently. The Stoics even tried to do something like that, but the church painted them green and hung them on the wall. By the way, I'm reading right now on Nietzsche's favorite Stoic was this figure named Epictetus, and he was a slave philosopher. And in fact, many Nietzschean specialists think that Nietzsche's concept of spiritual slavery or the preservation of spiritual slavery comes actually from the teachings of Epictetus, because he had this highly interesting, like, Stoic view of determinism, whereby he tried to concoct a philosophy where he had all of these followers who were mesmerized by his bodily condition of being a slave, yet insisting on a philosophy of spiritual freedom despite bodily enslavement. It's a super interesting thing. You can read his. We don't have anything written by him. It's just his, like, sayings that people wrote down when they followed him around, called the discourses. Anyways, the Stoics tried to do something similar, but the church painted them green and hung them on the wall, which made it such that we could no longer grasp what was at stake. They are no more recognizable than the lobster in Aesop's fable. The Stoics provided a certain solution to the double or nothing, which was the slave's position. Others might continue their struggles as they liked. The Stoics concerned themselves with something else, all of which merely repeats what I said earlier. Again, the exploitation of one man by another must be taken up at a level that is, let us say, ethical. The game involved in my right to imagine myself to be two, and in constituting my pure prestige, deserves to take on its import from the reminder of all these coordinates, because it is closely related to what is known as the discontent in civilization. The struggle to the death is perhaps a bit more complicated than its point of departure. We can gauge how far it goes in civilization that's characterized precisely by having taken it as its point of departure. Indeed, to return to the subject, Hegel's ideal master, represented by one, quote unquote, wins naturally, because it is he alone that wagers. It is precisely because he signified himself as two that, having one, he can latch on to the relationship that then gets established between the two and the one. Let me repeat that. It's because he signified himself as two, okay? And that, having one, he then latches onto the relationship that then gets established between the two and the one. Does that make sense to you guys? It makes sense to me. In other words, without the slave, his one, which is produced as a two by the slave, but then retroactively seen as a one, right? If you follow the movement, his oneness, his constituted oneness, is only possible from the slave, right?
Right.
He couldn't do it alone, in other words, right? That's actually a question, right? And perhaps you could even say Epictetus wants to say something like this in his conception. I'm happy to send a place in the Discord if you're interested in it. Since he laid the one on the table in the field of the other, there is no reason for him to stop. Against this one, he will wager the two. Okay. So it goes 1,
I think they now
1, 2, 3. Interesting. Okay. In other words, he enters into action assisted by his slave against anyone who has the same obsession as him and who believes himself to be a master. And that goes on in this way, according to the series about which I spoke to you some time back, because it can't be said that I don't spoon feed things to you. And then he has here 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21. And that continues up to 89 or some other remarkable number like that. It is the Fibonacci series characterized by the following, which we can see here on the screen. So unary trace of equals 1. Unary trace 1 equals 1. Okay, I don't fully follow this, but let's continue to see how he elaborates it. What is involved here is not very far from what our civilization leads to, namely that there are always people who are willing to take up the position of mastery. And it's not surprising that, as of the last count, we now have a UN of somewhere around 900 million people on our hands who became masters at the preceding stage. What is interesting about the Fibonacci series is not at all, of course, that it crudely reminds us of the present. If I'm speaking to you about it, it's because as the numbers get bigger, the value of UN minus 1 UN gets closer and closer to what is designated, and this is no accident, even though the context is different, by the same sign as the one which I designated as object A. This little irrational A is equal to, and then you have this formula here. Okay. The ratio is ever more clearly approximated by the further. It's interesting he uses the number 5 because that's a reference back to Aristotle, if we remember right, of the 5 operators. So that's something to keep in mind. This ratio is ever more closely approximated the further we go in the representation of the subject by one numerical signifier to another numerical signifier. Close approximation is obtained very quickly. There is no need to go up into the millions. When you're merely at the level of 21 or 34 and so on, you already obtain a value that's quite close to that of little a. I'm providing this example because the point is to try to understand via something other than the reference to the fire lit under 1 that I spoke about earlier, namely via the process itself. What happens when the game of the subject's representation is played out? Okay, so we're familiar with this Fibonacci business. I suppose the question that remains for me is why, once we get to the higher numbers in the process, does that inevitably return us to the point of the negation, to the point of the A object? That would be a question that I have for everyone. Maybe Luis, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I was thinking of what you said right now, but I was going to say that the formula, right, the one on the upper part, this is U0 equal 1, right? So I think this goes back to, yeah, that one on top, to how in set theory, how we read, you know, the empty set is count as 1, right? And then the 1 is the empty set that is counted, right? Yeah, and then, you know, then we have all this formula, right? Because then we can have, like, for example, 3 will be 1, 2, and then the empty set, right? So that we have 3, right? So that's how it works. And in that case, the A, right? Because this goes back to what we had before about the Fibonacci, the formula, right? The little a, the 1 minus a divided by a, I think it was the formula before, right?
Yeah, that sounds right.
Yeah, and yeah, that would be a, right? So a here represents the empty set, right? The first one, the just the set alone.
That's right. Yeah, that's helpful. That's the beginning point. Yeah, that is very helpful. Thank you for that. Right, which itself is barred. Yeah. Okay, Matilda, let's go. And probably we'll have to close soon only because it's getting late and I want to respect everybody's time. But we'll be sure to, like, you know, pick it up at point 3 here. next time.
That sounds good. Just gonna say, like, we come to a situation with our terms of like subjects, relation to the one other, the unary trait, the other, in which this master-slave dialectic is like paradigmatic or something. And it happens that what you were saying about like the master and its slave, somehow there's like this, there's two, but like it looks back somehow. Somehow there's a setup that is homologous to the Fibonacci sequence, which is that the Fibonacci sequence is that 1 divided by A equals 1 plus A. And basically he's just showing that like the situation is homologous to this Fibonacci sequence in a way. And he says earlier that like the A becomes more realized as the Fibonacci sequence plays out, because like the ratio of 1 to 2 is an approximation to A. The ratio of 3 to 5 is a closer approximation to A. And going on, so once you play it out further, you get a closer approximation of that irrational number A. And in prior lessons, he talks about how this playing out of a symbolic wound shows up in the imaginary as lack. And that was that whole elaboration on like, as empire and countings evolve, like lack becomes more concrete. So as the situation is established and this situation begins to develop and kind of roll, kind of like a snowball rolling down a hill, it just like kind of builds itself out a little bit more concretely. And this 5, this square root of 5 minus 1 divided by 2 is just like, if you go to Wikipedia and look up the Fibonacci sequence, this is just a more formalized equation for the irrational number A that is related to the Fibonacci sequence. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting, especially in context of Lacan mentioning this notion of the ensemble of sets and what you said about the expansion of complex sets one upon the other, and something about the locatability or the revealing therefore of lack is super essential, especially as it relates to the master-slave dialectic, in the sense that, like, what do you think Lacan is saying here about 900 million people on our hands who became masters at the preceding stage? It's a very interesting little
I'll post in the Discord about it. I'll have to think about it.
yeah, I mean, I think it's a certain Luis, did you have a new comment? Would you like to jump in quickly?
Yeah, because I mean he was talking about the master slave, like the master sacrifices the two, right? I think so. I think it's important to cover. So I'm not sure, but if we after we solve what is this A, right? Isn't he saying that the master sacrifices the slave in the sense that he sacrifices jouissance, right? In his struggle for prestige, he sacrificed jouissance too. But in that sense, he's not sacrificing his life, but he's sacrificing his jouissance. So could we say that in the other hand, the slave is sacrificing himself, like as one, right, to maintain his jouissance? Can we say that? I don't know.
Yeah. No, that is a good point, because he's not making that Heideggerian or even Kojevian claim, because Kojev is not saying that Kojev is saying that death is at stake, right? I don't think Lacan's clearly saying that that's not what's at stake. And that moreover, if it is jouissance that is at stake, then sure, this model of sociality still has a certain purchase. on our civilization, because again, going back to revolution and discontent, he's theorizing it in that Freudian way. So I think the 900 million is sort of this sense that like the gesture towards mastery is a part of the subjectivity of modern capitalism, of every consumer, maybe. Go ahead, Andrew.
Can you hear me? Can you guys hear me?
We can. We can.
Okay. Sorry, because I can't, my computer, I don't know, it's not showing me. Anyway, sorry. Yeah, exactly. I was going to basically reiterate what you're just saying, Daniel. I think that is really what he's driving at. It's rather epic, but he's basically saying in our modern era with the 900 million, he's talking about that the whole of the world, as so far as you become an adult, is engaged in this issue of a kind of, it's an ego ideal thing. So it's not really about that everyone's going to die in a battle with Musk. Obviously, as a leftist, I might oppose Musk, but I'm not going to probably go to my death fighting Musk personally or in any way, shape, or form, because I'm part of the bourgeois, or frankly. So I'm not going to tie my body up to the front of his house and burn myself to death to make a statement that he's a piece of shit and the world needs to change. I'm going to fight in a different way because I'm part of the whole bourgeois situation. And so we've got this complicated way in which we relate to ideal ego and ego ideal and all of that. I think that's what he's driving at. It's not so, we can't really make it some kind of romantic drama of like,
right,
we're going to fight to our death with Musk or fight to our death with Trump.
right,
Or,
right.
that would be totally ridiculous. That would be very.
No, you're right. No, you're right.
But it would be a mistake.
Well, no, but that's exactly right. But the funny thing is that the 900 million people who have a gesture, and I think gesture is the right word because he uses it above, towards mastery, right? All that means is that they posit their prestige on the market.
Right.
Right.
That's
and then therefore, however, capitalism, as we learn later, usurps any pretense to their attainment of such mastery, right? So therefore, the salute, like it's a done deal. There's no. It may take place, but it's not resolvable on its own discursive terms.
Right. The only thing I wanted to add is that the Fibonacci sequence is, by the way, is used within a lot of capitalist fields as just a way of projecting exponentials. There's other sequences that one can use that you just are basically trying to figure out if this expands at this rate, where am I going to get to? What is going to be the amount of widgets I'm going to need to make? So really seriously, Fibonacci is literally used as a way to map a projective sense of where the amount of accumulation will go. And there's other sequences that are used this way, but it's literally a mathematical way of projecting accumulation.
Do you mind if I add something?
Please.
People use Fibonacci when they play the stock market to see where the levels of the stocks will go. There's like a whole technique using Fibonacci. I'm wondering if this 900 million is him saying basically that there's a deadlock in capitalism between masters and slaves, and that it's kind of like his crisis theory or something, that there isn't going to be some massive 1% accumulation of wealth at one side that gets gradually smaller and smaller, but there's somehow this deadlock that occurs. I'm wondering if that's what he's meaning.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, I'm reminded of the only poem that Lacan ever published was on the hiatus irrationalis, which is the irrational point or irrational number. And it seems to me that there's a lot of people that read this seminar and they get frustrated with Lacan because they think that he's falling back on some kind of like mysticism of the object A. That's something for us to think about. I'm not really quite sure about that. But maybe I can post that poem on irrationality in the Discord so that we could study that. Which who was it that mentioned that to us? My interview with Dominique, he mentioned it. Okay, well, I think we should break because we've been going for a bit. Always a pleasure. One thing to note is that on September 17th, I am starting on Tuesday nights a Marxism study group on a new text that's been released recently called Western Marxism. So we can continue the Lacan group, perhaps just move it to another time, if that's all right. We can talk about that in the Discord as well, because I do think that we're making a lot of interesting progress here. And it would be useful to like not stop.
I'd like to continue.
Okay. Let's talk about that at some point. And okay. Are we good? Then we're good. Then all right. Thanks everybody.
Yeah, as usual, it was a pleasure
Always.
seeing you and
Always a
everybody
pleasure.
else.
Thank you.
Take care.